Hello guys, so today I'm going to talk about something that I always think about, and that is how to name props in my components. So we'll go through three principles that are always at the back of my mind when adding props to components. So let's get started. So we are going to work with this button component here. So this component accepts one prop currently, and that is a label. So you pass a label to it, and then it returns a button component with that label as its text. So we are going to gradually add props to this button, and I'll talk through my thinking while I'm adding these props. So first of all, if you look at the button styling here, there are different classes that can be applied to the button. So there's a primary button, there is a secondary button, there is a danger button, there is a success button. So you want to be able to pass these class names to the button via props, right? So the first thing you can think of is if you want this button to be a primary button, you could add a primary boolean prop, right? If you want it to be a secondary button, we add a secondary boolean prop. If you want it to be a success button, we add a success prop. And if you want it to be a danger button, we add a danger prop. So you want to use these props to add the correct class name to this button. So let's read the props here. So you have the primary prop, we have the secondary prop, we have the success prop, and then we have the danger prop. So because our button component has the class names designed like this, so it's button dash danger, then button dash success, then button dash secondary, button dash primary. So we could, for example, maybe try to add the correct class name like that. So what we do is we just do an if else check, right? And then as a prop to the button, we just add the class name equals to the class name variable. Oh, and also remember, we also need to include the prefixes here. So in our generated class names here, we could add the button prefix like that. So let's save it and then try to test it. So if we say this is a primary button like that, we get the primary classes on the button. If we say it's a secondary button, we get the secondary classes. If we say it's a success button, we get the success classes. And finally, if we say it's a danger button, we get the danger classes. So this looks like it works, right? But it doesn't look right. And also we could add multiple of these props at once. So we could add the success prop, we could add the secondary prop, for example. So which class will be added? So you can see that the secondary prop has overridden the success prop. If you look at the button component here, we are limited by the way we implement the if else clauses. So if we add primary class name at first and then we add secondary class name, then the secondary class name won't be used. The primary class name will be used. So if we do this, we add the primary class name, then you can see the primary class name is used, the secondary class name is ignored. So our options are limited by the order in which they appear, right? So if we add the secondary class name first before the primary class name will still get applied. But anyway, if a button is a secondary component, you don't want it to be also a primary component. You want to provide only one prop. So you can't be providing primary, secondary, danger, and success props all at once. You want to only apply one prop that covers all this, so that the ambiguity on which of these props will be used is removed completely. So to fix this, if you look at these class names here, they look similar, right? They're all doing a similar thing, applying a different color and background color depending on the class name. So I'd like to think of all these class names here as variants of one class name or variant of one state. So what we can do is, instead of adding all these separately, we could group them into one prop. We can call it a variant, right? So we can only pass one of these four states. So with that, we can reduce the code we are writing here. So here we are only accepting the variant prop, and then instead of using these if statements, we can just check if the variant is set, then we can add the button prefix and then with the variant. So this now becomes a constant like that. So in the props here, we can now switch these with the variant prop. So we can say for the primary button, we use the primary variant, and then for the secondary button, we use the secondary variant. For the success button, we use the success variant, and also for the danger button, we use the danger variant. So we have reduced the amount of logic for this component and made it a bit cleaner than it was before. Okay, let's think about another prop that we may want to add to our button. So we could go for something like the loading state of the button. So we could add an is loading state as a boolean, right? And then then we get it from the props, and then we change the label according to the loading state. So if it is loading, then we use the loading text, otherwise we use the label. Looks straightforward. So if we go to our component here, if the button is loading, then we add an is loading prop like that, then automatically we get the loading text. So what if we want to show a loading spinner when the button is loading? So we could add another element here. So we just check if it's loading, then we can show the loading spinner. So we just import our loading spinner component like that. So you can see we are showing the spinner, right? So we are showing two separate elements here according to the state. So I want to introduce another idea about our button component here. So let's say we want to control what is visible on the button component. So for example, we want to be able to hide the loading spinner if it's loading, right? So like we want this spinner to be an optional element in this component. So we could think of another prop that we could add, right? So for example, we could say maybe a show spinner boolean, right? So show spinner, and then if it's loading and we pass in the show spinner, then we show the spinner, right? So by default, the spinner is hidden. So this is completely okay, right? In our button component here, we can just pass the show spinner boolean, and then the spinner will show back up. So another way I like to think about the elements in a component, I like to think of them as having two states, having the default state and having the modified state. So for this button component, instead of explicitly telling it to show the spinner, I want the spinner to be there by default, but I want the parent component to be able to hide the spinner. So if you load the component without the show spinner prop, I want all the elements that the component renders to be visible by default, and then you can add extra props to hide them. So for the show spinner prop here, for example, we could by default set it to true in the component props here so that it's shown by default. But that goes against the mental model I just outlined. So I don't need to use this prop at all to show the spinner. I want the spinner to be visible by default and then hide it if the parent component wants to hide it. So instead of having what I call positive props, right? Like instead of show spinner or show loading or show element, I always use negative props in order to hide elements. So like if you pass a negative prop, then you can use it to hide an element in your component. So here's what I mean. Instead of show spinner, I use hide spinner. So that is the negative version of showing a spinner. So here, instead of show spinner here, we use the hide spinner like that. So if the hide spinner is not set, then the spinner is shown by default. So if we save this file, then every single one of the elements will be shown in loading state. So in loading state, we'll show the spinner and the loading text. If you want to hide the spinner, we have to specifically pass in the hide spinner property. So here we hide an element in our button component like that, and then the spinner is no longer visible. I don't know if that makes sense, but the idea of it is showing everything in the component and then hiding elements via a prop instead of hiding everything in the component and then showing them via a prop. I hope that makes sense. So one other idea I want to talk about is not being able to limit the props that a component accepts. So for example, for this button component, there is a lot of things you can pass to the button component. You can, for example, make it disabled or even add extra class names to this button component. But the way the button is designed right now, in order to add those extra props to the button element, we need to add them to our button props here. So even things like event listeners, right? Like on-click handlers. So we don't have a way to accept the on-click handler on this button component without having to go to the button props here. So you manually have to add something like that, for example, and then use it in the props, and then finally add it to the button element like that. So on click, then we can use the on click prop. So every other prop we'll be adding have to go through the same process, and that is making our component longer for no reason. And we want to make this component as clean and as simple as possible. So what I like to do is if I return an HTML element here, like this button component, we can make this button component accept all the props that a button element accepts. So if you hover over the button element here, you can see that the props are typed as the detail HTML props React button attribute element. So because I'm using TypeScript, right, I could add those button prop types to my button props type here. So we paste it here and then we intersect it with our button props. So our button props element here now accepts all the props that a button accepts plus the custom props that you have added. And then we can pass them to our props by just destructuring the rest of the props like that and then passing them to our component like that. So any button props passed to this component will be directly passed to the button element. So if we go to our component here, we can add on click handler here, for example, without having to manually add the on click prop to the element. So anything that can be added to the button element, like the area props here, will be directly passed to the button element. So this makes a lot of things easier. So if we go back to the button component, there's something here that seems redundant. So the class name prop here. So you're just receiving a variant prop and then adding the button dash as a substring to that prop and adding it as a component. But we can get rid of this step altogether. So we can get rid of the class name prop and the variant prop here. And then, so remove that and remove class name. Like that. So by default, this is the default state for the button. If you go to where the button component is used, because the button now accepts all props that a button element accepts, we could pass a class name prop directly with the variant we want. So we could pass the button success, for example, and automatically we get the success state for the button, or the button primary, and that's the same thing we were doing before. But now we have moved most of the control over to the parent component. And this way, we can add extra class names and extra states to our button. For example, if we look at our button component here, there is an inverse class name that inverts the colors for the button according to their state. So if we go back here, we could, for example, add an inverse class name and then we get the inverted state for the button. So if we use the success variant, we get the color of the text becomes the background color and the background color becomes the color of the state. So it's inverted. So we are adding different states to this button without having to add them as props. You're only controlling it via the CSS. So I think those are the three main ideas I had for this week's video. I hope you learned something new, and if I got something wrong, please feel free to ping me in the comments so that I can also learn while trying to teach. So thank you so much for watching, and see you in the next video.